Good morning, everyone. My name is Rabbi Abraham Cooper. It's my honor to serve as chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. And this morning's hearing, Advancing Religious Freedom Within the U.S.-India Bilateral Relationship. Thank you to our distinguished witnesses for taking the time to join us today and for offering their insight on how the United States can better support religious freedom in India. While the focus of this hearing is to discuss policy options available for advancing religious freedom, we are encouraged and inspired that so many civil society and human rights organizations have submitted additional statements for the record, which will be made available on our website. We appreciate the work of these groups who continually document and highlight conditions on the ground, which is crucial to informing our research and reporting on India. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, is an independent, bipartisan U.S. government advisory body created by the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, or IRFA. The Commission uses international standards to monitor freedom of religion or belief abroad and makes policy recommendations to the U.S. government. Today, USCIRF exercises its statutory authority under IRFA to convene this important hearing. Religious freedom conditions in India have notably declined in recent years. Since 2020, USCIRF has recommended the State Department designate India as a country of particular concern, or CPC, for its systematic, ongoing, and egregious religious freedom violations, including the Indian government's promotion and enforcement of laws and policies that target religious minorities: Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Dalits, Adivasis, are experiencing increased levels of attacks and acts of intimidation. The national government has continued to suppress minority voices and those advocating on their behalf through surveillance, harassment, demolition of property, and detention under the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. These trends and their implication for U.S. foreign policy should not be ignored. It's important to note that this hearing is taking place just months after Prime Minister Narendra Modi's high-profile state visit to Washington, D.C., where he met with President Biden and addressed the joint session of Congress. When directly asked about India's treatment of religious minorities during a White House press conference, Prime Minister Modi responded that, quote, "There is no space for discrimination," unquote, in India, and suggested that steps did not need to be taken to advance religious freedom in the country. Yet, for the past several years, religious freedom conditions in India have continued in a downward trend, capturing international attention and highlighting the need for continuing discussions and engagement on policy options for advancing religious freedom in the country. In the last few months alone, attacks against the country's Muslim and Christian minority communities have been particularly concerning. In July, violence erupted between Hindus and Muslims following a Hindu procession in the Muslim neighborhood of near New Delhi. During the unrest, the mosque was torched and a deputy imam was killed. Hundreds of Muslim homes were demolished and Muslim-owned businesses were targeted, with widespread calls for boycotts. Unfortunately, these kinds of incidents and call for violence against minority groups are becoming more and more common. Last month, Prime Minister Modi faced a vote of no confidence for his government's response to the ongoing violence against minority Christian Kuke community in Manipur that began in May. Waves of violence have targeted religious symbols and places of worship and refuge, including churches and synagogues. Mobs burned or damaged more than 250 churches of different denominations and 2 synagogues across the state, displacing hundreds of thousands of people. And in these and other instances of mass violence, the quick spread of disinformation and hate speech on social media has stoked mob vigilantism and other types of communal violence throughout the country. These are just a few examples that highlight the particularly severe religious freedom violations taking place in India, which our distinguished witnesses will discuss in much greater detail. And just to add a personal note, I want to use the hearings, both the beginning and I'll repeat it at the end, that USERF reiterates its request to be allowed to come to India and to speak to all parties concerned on the very volatile issues we are discussing this morning. I believe in the history of USERF, and certainly to date, since I've been a member of this commission, the Indian governments have not given permission to USERF to officially visit. I would now like to briefly introduce our distinguished first witness. Each of our witnesses' full biographies can be found in the bio sheets provided, and they're also on our website. Dr. Fernand de Varens is, since 2017, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. As part of his mandate, he is the reference point at the UN on the protection of human rights of national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities. He is also adjunct and visiting professor at the National University of Ireland, Galway, a visiting professor at the Université Catholique de Lyon in France, and at the European Regional MA in Democracy and Human Rights in SEEC, Global Campus, Southeast Europe, University of Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina. That's quite a business card alone. He completed his law degrees in Canada, the UK, and the Netherlands. He's the author of some 300 publications that have appeared in more than 30 languages, is acknowledged as a renowned global leading expert on human rights of minorities, and has been awarded a number of accolades, including the 2021 prize of the Federalist Union of European Nationalities, the 2004 Lingua Pa Award, Barcelona, Spain, the Knight's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland, and the Tip O'Neill Peace Fellowship in Northern Ireland. We are honored that you've been able to join us this morning for give us an overview of an extremely complicated and an extremely important issue. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair Cooper. The honor is mine. Distinguished commissioners, good morning, bonjour. We sometimes tend to focus so much on the trees that we don't see the forest. Let me summarize, I think, the situation with 3 words: massive, systematic, and dangerous. Along with a number of UN Special Rapporteurs, I have recently expressed grave and growing concerns regarding the deteriorating situation of religious freedom and human rights in India. We have, in the last decade, for example, issued numerous communications and press releases, communications being allegations of human rights violations that are raised through diplomatic channels to the concerned governments. They show a steady and alarming erosion of fundamental rights, particularly for religious and other minorities, when we reviewed communications from about 2011 to today. By last year, 2022, almost all of them involved grave allegations of denial of fundamental rights, particularly targeting religious minorities. And for example, from the 12th of May 2020 to just a few months ago, May 2023, we had about 46 communications and an estimated 20 press releases involving India, and most of these involving minorities, the vast majority of these. The most recent example, the most recent communication that we issued is perhaps symptomatic. On the 4th of September, myself and 18 other colleagues expressed our alarm about reports of serious human rights violations in Manipur, including alleged acts of sexual violence, extrajudicial killings, forced displacement, and other ill treatment, where the victims were from the predominantly Christian Kuki or Kukai minority last May. Now, there are dry statistics. I could say there were 160 persons reportedly killed by mid-August. Thousands of homes and hundreds of churches have been burnt down, and some of you will have heard of a video which circulated on social media of two women from the Christian Kuki community being paraded naked, beaten, then brought to a field and allegedly gang raped. Let's go to the field. Let's go on the ground and perhaps describe more accurately what happened. There was inaction from authorities until this video caught the international attention. I saw that video, and what it showed was hatred directed against women because they were considered a threat, unworthy, less human, because they belonged to a despised religious and ethnic minority. That's why they were raped. That's why they were beaten. It was only after the shock and outcry and pressure from the outside that men from the Hindu majority were finally arrested and charged. By the way, these individuals for months circulated freely and behaved with complete impunity for months, despite the highly visible, public, and horrific nature of what occurred. And this, unfortunately, is not an isolated incident. We receive multitudes of reports of attacks, rapes, lynchings of members of religious minorities. We also have reports of national, state, and local religiously discriminatory policies and legislation targeting, well, amongst others, and you've mentioned some of these, Chair, religious conversion, interfaith relationships, the killing of cows, the wearing of hijabs, and other practices that restrict and prohibit religious beliefs or practices of minorities mainly. And all of these make a mockery of freedom of religion and non-discrimination guarantees for these religious and other minorities. Human rights defenders, lawyers, and journalists face harassment, surveillance, detention, and worse sometimes under the, as mentioned previously, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. You also know that non-governmental organizations have also been targeted and in some cases closed under the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act and also other legislation. Now let me repeat, India risks becoming, in my opinion, based on the information I've received and the allegations we've received, it risks becoming one of the world's main generators of instability, atrocities, and violence because of the massive scale and gravity of the violations and abuses targeting, not exclusively, but mainly religious and other minorities, such as Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and others. It's not just individual or local. It is systematic and a reflection of, well, I guess the best description is religious nationalism. There is a discriminatory citizenship determination process in Assam, which many of you will know about in detail, but potentially also other regions of the world. Assam is a model being looked at very closely in other parts of India, and this we should be very concerned with. But this process could lead to millions being denied citizenship, and mainly, not exclusively again, but mainly from the Muslim minority community. And this process has to be seen also in the light of the 1999 Citizenship Amendment Act, which provides a fast track to citizenship for individuals unless you're a Muslim. Now, there's a religious test here, which does not sit well with democratic values and fundamental international human rights. Now, there are fears expressed by many that this may be part of an effort to create a religious and discriminatory test for citizenship. The disenfranchisement of millions also, again, mainly Muslims because of their religion, has occurred through the revocation in 2019 of the special status of autonomy of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, under the direct control of the central Indian government, this really means that the local elected bodies have been discarded, and the right of political participation and representation of, once again, mainly Muslim and other minorities in Jammu and Kashmir has effectively been stripped away. And they've lost many of their previous political rights. A study noted recently that there has been a staggering increase, a 786% increase in hate crimes against minorities between 2014 and 2018. It is also widely acknowledged that hate speech and content inciting violence against religious minorities in social media is widespread, increasing, vitriolic, and involving incitement to violence and even calls to genocide. And not always, but we could say generally, these are largely left unchallenged by state authorities. Official silence is too often occurring over violent attacks and rhetoric, and this is encouraging majority nationalist groups to even more brazen violence with a religious tint. We must never forget that. The violence in Manipur is also a warning of the dangers of inaction. The danger is that left alone, many more Manipurs may erupt. India ranks as 8th country with the highest risk of mass killings. This is extremely dangerous, as I noted earlier. And this is mainly because of the targeting of religious and other minorities, and is symptomatic of large-scale scapegoating and dehumanizing and instrumentalization of Muslims and other religious others that could lead to a slide towards horrific atrocities. Unless we forget, there cannot be peace and stability without justice, and that is the fundamental principle on which the Universal Declaration of Human Rights rests. There is, of course, much more that could be said, time permitting, but I have a written summary, if you will, of the information that I've mentioned, which I can share with the commissioners if this would be of any assistance. Thank you very much again for the honor and the privilege of being before this distinguished commission. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Special Rapporteur, Dr. De Varnes. As chair, I have the privilege of asking the first question, and since I'm a rabbi, it usually means there are two parts to it, so please excuse me. First one is sort of more of an overview, if you will. If you can briefly give us some perspective on how much of these 786%, a staggering figure, can be traced back to ethnicity, and how much traced back to religion. For us, it's not just an intellectual exercise. Our mandate is religious freedom, human rights seen through the lens of religious freedom. And you mentioned it briefly. If you have, again, some more perspective for us, because social media continues to play an increasingly dominant role in everyone's lives virtually around the world. You mentioned that vigilante violence is often stoked by disinformation and social media. What is the role of the government, if at all, in combating this type of disinformation and holding perpetrators accountable? What methods or policies do you think could be effective in combating this type of disinformation?
Thank you very much, Chair Cooper. I do not have a clear breakdown, for example, of the, in the case of hate crimes involving the rise of hate crimes, the high level of hate crimes involving minorities. I don't have the statistic concerning a breakdown between ethnic and versus religion. Quite often, that would be a very difficult breakdown to provide. When we talk about the Kuki minority, for example, they are at the same time an ethnic and religious, and even we could say linguistic minority. So I think it is an exercise which would be very difficult because you have a mesh of these characteristics that describe the identity of a particular community, and quite often I think it may not be possible or very useful to do so. In any event, I think what is significant in this case, and perhaps should retain our attention, is that in many cases, even though individuals can be distinguished on the basis of their ethnicity, the form of nationalism that is often expressed and the intolerance and prejudice that you can see in social media it often has a religious flavor to it, even though there may be, in addition, ethnic components, for example. If we think of in the case of Assam, many of the hate speech that is circulates in social media is actually mainly targeted towards the Bengali Muslim minority, ethnic and religious at the same time, and you cannot, and you should not, in my opinion, dissociate one and the other. However, to go back to what is central to your question, I think, is that the form of prejudice that is, and hatred that tends to circulate a great deal in social media from other studies, which I can provide information about, almost always has a religious dimension. Not always, but I would say the vast majority of these do. Therefore, this is perhaps the best information I can provide, but I do have other surveys that emphasize, that try to provide a breakdown of the kind of hate speech in particular that you have in Indian social media currently. In terms of the role of government to combat hate speech in social media, there's an obligation, responsibility on the part of our government, but also a danger which we should be aware of. The danger is that, unfortunately, there are reports of government using current legislation to actually repress, if you will, human rights defenders, of actually targeting the victims and those who are trying to protect the human rights of religious and other minorities. So it is a kind of dangerous distortion of existing legislation that sometimes occur. To answer your question more directly, what should we expect from governments currently in relation to fighting hate crime and especially hate speech and incitement to violence and discrimination in social media? Implement legislation, ensure that the legislation they have in place conforms with international human rights obligations in relation to the balance between freedom of expression and combating incitement to violence and discrimination. This is not occurring in India. There is a unbalance or legislation that actually almost completely ignores the obligations of the Indian government under existing international treaties, and that, to me, is the main guidance, a guiding post that needs to emphasize, and which does not exist currently.
Thank you, and we would love to see some additional material to be sent to the Commission. Vice Chair Davey, if you have a question, please.
Sure. Thank you, Chair. You mentioned that in your testimony that the National Register of Citizens in Assam has been used as a model in other parts of India. Would you please, if you could, speak a little more about how this has been implemented and about the status of those who've been excluded from the National Register?
Thank you very much, Vice Chair. The pandemic has actually had a good effect in that it seems to have delayed the process in Assam, the National Registry of Citizens, and the potential loss of citizenship or non-recognition of citizenship of millions, I think about 2 million individuals in Assam. There has been also the process that went in place to appeal, if you will, the absence from the Registry of Citizens has been delayed and apparently is kind of in a a very slow situation. In other words, things have not been proceeding in terms of the process to deny or not recognize citizenship, and the process also that would allow individuals to be recognized, to be added to the citizenship registry. Apparently right now, however, there is fear that this situation of uncertainty is actually still very difficult or even dangerous for almost 1 million or more than 1 million, almost 2 million individuals whose status is uncertain, and they are being denied access to basic services, for example, because their status is undetermined. There is extremely burdensome bureaucracy behind all of this, and right now things have not been moving forward because things have not been clarified, if you will, or have not been proceeding as they should because of the pandemic. However, there are reports that in West Bengal, another region in India, that there are some parties, some politicians putting forward a possible registry of citizens also for that region, and there are hints that at the national level there might be something like this also be considered.
Thank you very much. I yield to the chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Wolf.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony. It was very informative. I was writing some notes down, and I have two questions basically based on what you said. Do you personally, and I think it's important personally because your view, do you personally believe that Prime Minister Modi could change what is taking place in India? And part of that question, does Prime Minister Modi care about what you and others are saying about him?
I wish I knew. I would answer, Commissioner, in the following way. Politically, it may, if pressure can be exercised by United Nations, the United Nations, independent experts, and especially national governments, on the Indian government and Prime Minister Modi, there is potential, or there's always a possibility of a change of direction, of delaying certain actions that are quite clearly massive and perhaps even atrocious, if that's the correct word. Therefore, politically, it may be able to exercise enough pressure to convince the Modi government that the time has come to actually change certain policies. One should never underestimate the possible impact of international pressure, especially coming from allies of the United States. The case of Manipur, I think that I illustrated, is an example of this. It was because of international attention, and I would say pressure, that you have a number of men who have committed the atrocities and the alleged rape of the Kuki women. It was only after this international focus appeared that state authorities in India actually proceeded to the arrest of those who may have been the perpetrators. So I think politically there is a great deal that could be done, but one has to admit, and I personally view it, that necessary to put pressure on the Modi government, on Prime Minister Modi at many different levels. And I take this opportunity as if I may. I noticed that you had a hearing on the status of Tajikistan. I am going to Tajikistan on a country mission, as a matter of fact, in a few weeks. I do know the situation in Tajikistan. The situation in Tajikistan pales when we look at the massive and the degree of atrocities committed in India on the basis of religion. And so it seems that if one country such as Tajikistan is a country of particular concern, given what we know about India, the logic would seem to suggest that India should be considered along those lines.
Well, thank you. You answered the second question before I asked it, so I'm going to add a little bit to it. It was, what could we do or what could be done to change what is taking place? And I think you answered that really before I asked the question. So the last question I would have is, and I don't know anything about the gentleman, can you appeal to his better angels? And who in the world has the ability to sit down and say, dear Mr. Prime Minister, this is not good, and for your future and for the future of India, for the good, can you appeal to his better angels? And who could do that, do you believe? Thank you. And again, thank you. I've learned a lot. I appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. I'm an optimist. By the way, in my job, you have to be an optimist to be involved in human rights. There's a saying, I'm not sure how to translate this in English, but you always have to be honest when you're dealing with friends or allies in order to make sure that they behave in the right way. And the United States is a very close ally to India. It is a democracy, and as a democracy, I think there are much that needs to be said in all frankness and honesty. In my view, it is for the government of the United States to be very frank here and indicate that there are serious areas of concern. And as a friend and an ally, these have to be addressed in order to ensure, well, peace, stability, and justice. Because if we don't have that, we are heading towards, as I said, a massive, dangerous situation in India. And this will have repercussions on the United States.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We have 9 commissioners. Our good friend David Curry has been in direct contact with members of the Christian community and other minorities in India. And I have the privilege of asking him to ask you a few questions.
Thank you, Chair Cooper. Can y'all hear me okay? Appreciate your comments. They ring true to me. I've become convinced that India has the most sophisticated, systematic persecution of religious minorities by any democratic government, and I don't say that lightly. When you talk about harassment of journalists, others, you have both agents of the government and non-agent. We see this in America where they are harassing Indian citizens who live here, elsewhere. Does the UN track that in other countries? Is that part of your mandate to track the harassment of the Indian government against religious minorities who are in other outside of India? International repression, that sort of thing?
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Commissioner, for that question. Even as part as a special rapporteur, and my mandate is special rapporteur on minorities, I look at the situation of religious minorities in all countries of the world, in a sense. Although there are also other entities, UN entities, that also will look at violations of freedom of religion, which overlaps with religious minorities around the world. And we have different mechanisms, in other words, there are different committees that look into such matters. So there are many different branches, in fact, that do focus particularly on violations, not only on India, but on every country in the world as such.
I think as it relates to Commissioner Wolf's comments, that there's much that the United States and the UN and others can do to draw attention to this, because there are very serious implications. My second question, then I want to give the floor over to my other commissioners. I've heard of drafts of a new constitution which deny voting rights to Muslims, Sikhs, Christians. You referred to a citizenship issue for some Muslims. Is the UN tracking that at all? Is aware of any constitutional drafts that would deny voting rights?
I am not aware of that being the case, if there is any. I would suspect there are, but I'm not privy to that information as such. And may I take this opportunity to perhaps raise one of your closest allies and neighbors, what has occurred in Canada, and the Prime Minister raising certain allegations, quite serious allegations, of Indian agents perhaps being involved in the assassination of a Canadian citizen who is a Sikh. And as you know, the Sikhs are a member of a religious minority. Without commenting on the veracity of this, because many things are still uncertain, this is important in terms of making sure the message is sent clearly to the government of India that certain types of conduct are not acceptable. I repeat the 3 words I used earlier: massive, systematic, and dangerous. And as an ally, the U.S. should also raise all of its concerns very directly and perhaps bluntly, because the situation, if I can perhaps make a personal observation in conclusion, the situation in India in terms of religious freedom and the discrimination and exclusion of religious minorities is one of the worst in the world.
Thank you so much for your comments.
Just before we go on to Commissioner Schneck, let me just ask, what role, if any, do you see the European Union playing in this situation? Obviously, you represent the United Nations. You've correctly underscored the need for the United States to pay closer attention. The horrific event took place in Canada. The EU is an extremely powerful economic bloc. What role, if any, do you see the European countries in this issue?
I wish the European Union would listen to me, but I will be in the European Parliament, actually, in a few days, actually. I think all international and regional organizations that are committed, if you will, to principles of democracy and human rights have a moral, and I would even say legal obligation to exert pressure on India in any way they can. If we forget the moral principles on which we are built upon, then we are supping with the devil, to use a rather colorful expression. This is a very, I would say, historical moment, a pivotal moment. We actually have to be honest and frank and firm in order to have the situation change. And that includes the United States and the European Union and all other international or regional organizations whose mandate actually are based on principles of either democracy or rule of law or values of inclusion and integration.
Thank you. Commissioner Schneck.
Thank you, Chair Cooper. Everyone hear me all right? First, Dr. Devarens, let me express my gratitude for you being here today and how much I appreciate and am moved by the alarming testimony that you've given. Massive, systematic, dangerous, the three words you used to describe this situation. Last November, I had the duty to be part of a mission of USURF to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh to witness firsthand the implications of genocide, the genocide occurring in Burma. One of the first groups, in fact, that we visited at the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar was a Hindu group that had been expelled or had became refugees as a result of the situation there. So I'm wondering if we're not seeing the seeds of something in India that might point in a similar horrible direction. If something is not done, Dr. Devarens, could we be seeing the start of something that might truly be genocidal? And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. The short answer is possibly yes. The longer answer is that there are lessons to be learned. When you deny citizenship to large groups of people because of their religion or race, that prepares the ground to treating them as lesser than you, lesser humans in a sense. We've seen it with the Holocaust. And in fact, when Nazi Germany removed citizenship to a number of Jews in Germany. We've seen what has happened in Myanmar and Burma when 1 million Rohingya, mainly Rohingya Muslims, were denied citizenship, treated as others, dangerous, lesser deserving. That created not only a humanitarian crisis, but a situation where a genocide, an attempted genocide, was easier to commit. It's not too much of a leap of logic to say that we are creating the conditions where something similar could happen. Because in Assam, they're in the process, it's not finished, but they're in the process of denying almost 2 million people citizenship because they are others, mainly, once again, because of their religion and race. And so we are creating conditions where the most atrocious of crimes could potentially happen again. Yes.
Thank you. And our last but not least, Commissioner, our good friend, Commissioner Magid, if you have a question, last question for the Special Rapporteur.
Thank you so much, sir, for your testimony this morning. I would like to ask you about the arresting and detaining of imams in the Kashmir region and the use of law, the Public Safety Act. And there's any way that this matter of detaining the imams and religious leaders in this act can be addressed in terms of creating a mechanism of bringing those imams and religious leaders being arrested to the attention of various government that are, friend with the Indian government. The other issue, the issue of censorship. I know that some religious leaders are reading reports their ceremony being censored, whether Christians or Muslims. I want you to shed light on this.
Thank you very much for your question, Commissioner. I think it is important to keep in mind that there have been efforts from international organizations. I have issued a couple of communications on the situation in Kashmir. And the situation in Kashmir also has began a number of years ago, but particularly from 2019. I think what is important is to always draw attention on the need to guarantee the human rights of everyone, including religious minorities, imams, and others, and to emphasize India's obligations in that regard. India, and this is on the public record, has often claimed or asserted that because it's a democracy and it respects rule of law, that we shouldn't worry about the situation in India. I would say that that's a facile response, but what is important is to ensure that it is a democracy which complies with the rule of law in respect of international human rights obligations. And that last bit is missing. And this is the part I believe very strongly we have to emphasize. What is the law is being misused here in ways which unfortunately is possible as law because they are not fully respecting, complying with the rights of the people in Kashmir, and religious leaders such as imams in Kashmir. We have tried, or I have tried, to some extent, to raise the visibility of this issue and to increase the pressure. I've even raised some of these issues before the UN Secretary General in New York and at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. What needs to be done is more pressure from, in my opinion, from governments, from allies of India, to make sure that they remember that democracy with law also needs rights guarantees. And right now you do not have the right balance in this, which allows this kind of conduct to be conducted with relative impunity. Once again, it is very important for the United States, Canada, the European Union, and others to actually raise not only their concerns, but increase their pressure in a very strong, assertive, frank way. And we are doing somewhat this at the United Nations. I believe you'll be seeing more efforts in that direction. And this is perhaps one way that you can build enough pressure to have certain gestures made. As I said, even in the case of Manipur, we were able to have individuals arrested for what occurred to the Kuki women. At the governmental level, it has to be from the governmental level, government to government also, that more is being done in a strong but firm way.
Thank you, Special Rapporteur, for being here and for actually threatening to give the United Nations a good name. This is a week they need all the help they can get, so we're pleased you're here in D.C., and thank you for your guidance.
Thank you, I think.
Sunita Viswanath is the Executive Director of Hindus for Human Rights. She's worked for over 30 years in women's rights and human rights organizations. She's co-founder of Hindus for Human Rights in June 2019 and also serves as a board member. In 2001, she co-founded the International Women's Human Rights Organization, Women for Afghan Women, and served as board chair until 2022. There's so much here. She was honored by President Obama at the White House in 2015 as a champion of change for her work with Sanhana. In 2021, she was recognized by the Center for American Progress as one of 21, quote, faith leaders to watch. She's an advisory board member at the Population Media Center and is a board member of the Dalit Solidarity Forum. She is one of 5 Hindus appointed to New York City Mayor Eric Adams' Faith Transition Team, and the only Hindu in December 2021 Marquis Who's Who list of faith-based influencers. During today's hearings, Sunita will be reading a joint statement on behalf of Dalit Solidarity Forum, the Federation of Indian American Christian Organizations of North America, the Indian American Muslim Council, the India Civil Watch International, and the New York State Council of Churches. Sunita, before you arrived, we did read your the full bio that was presented to us, but more importantly, we've already announced that your statement is going to be made on behalf of about 7 different organizations, which we've listed. And so we invite you to make your presentation now.
Thank you for inviting me to testify. We, our coalition, the organizations that you already announced, are disappointed that Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and Dalits who face the brunt of religious freedom and human rights violations under Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi have not been invited to speak on this panel. The Biden administration is in denial of religious persecution in India, failing to call out India's persecution of its 250 million Muslims and 40 million Christians. In June, President Biden shocked the world by applauding India's, quote, open, tolerant, robust debate with Modi standing next to him at the White House, just 2 days after 75 members of U.S. Congress had written to President Biden expressing concern over the shrinking of political space, the rise of religious intolerance, the targeting of civil society organizations and journalists, and growing restrictions on press freedoms and internet access in India. Yesterday, the New York Times wrote, Mr. Biden has soft-pedaled any criticism of the increasing suppression of minority groups and opposition voices in India and the encouragement of Hindu nationalism under Mr. Modi. 2 days ago, the Canadian Prime Minister accused India of assassinating a Sikh Canadian citizen. If true, it would be a reminder that the dangerous Hindu nationalist violence has reached our shores. Many Americans have been intimidated and harassed by and received death threats from Indian operatives. To them, India's possible complicity in this assassination has an element of plausibility that is bound to have a chilling effect on civil rights activism in India. We implore the Biden administration to urgently acknowledge that India under Modi is on a dangerous and alarming path towards religious authoritarianism and is undeniably a country of particular concern. Encouraged by America's silence, the fanatical and murderous ideology of Hindu nationalism in India has now reached a new low, instigating horrific violence against Christians and Muslims, including extrajudicial killings, mob lynchings, arbitrary arrests, and demolition of their homes and places of worship. Graphic sexual violence against women has sharply risen, most horrifically demonstrated in a viral video from Manipur state. Of course, such violence against Dalit community predates the Modi regime, but has significantly become worse since his coming to power. Since May, more than 180 people have been killed, 400 at least churches burnt to the ground, and 50,000 Christians driven from their homes in Manipur. This violence has been carried out by militant mobs, supported and armed by the state administration run by the BJP, Modi's party, and egged on by the police. In Uttarakhand state, mobs backed by the BJP-ruled administration have forced thousands of Muslims to flee as their homes and businesses were demolished. We also object to the Modi government's closing of FCRA accounts, which has barred American charities from continuing to serve the needs of marginalized Indian people. We decry the misuse of conversion laws to stop both Indian and American Christians from doing charitable work. And we object to the intimidation, denial of entry, and even detention of American visitors to India who represent religious minority groups. Sadly, the man at the apex of the escalating violence against religious minorities, Narendra Modi, is being feted by government after government, including ours, who are paying lip service to human rights. The rejection by the Biden and Trump administrations of USCIRF's recommendation to designate India as a CPC for 3 years in a row is a troubling precedent. If the Biden administration continues its uncritical embrace of the Modi government, despite mounting violations of religious freedom and human rights in India, America will carry the burden of being on the wrong side of history. USERV's credibility has historically rested on its mandate to remain independent in calling out religious freedom violations worldwide without political interference. Only USERV is in a position to speak truth to power, as it has by recommending that the U.S. designate India as a CPC and sanction Indian officials engaged in religious persecution. The first step to advancing religious freedom in India within U.S.-India bilateral relations would be for Secretary Blinken to designate India as a CPC in December. As a Hindu and as the Executive Director of Hindus for Human Rights, I reiterate that we stand unequivocally in solidarity with India's minority communities. Our Hindu faith and Indian democracy have pluralism and religious freedom at their heart. Some of our allied organizations have submitted separate statements, which they would like entered into the record. We all want for India and the United States to be trade partners, political allies, friends. What kind of friend will we have in India if India's democracy collapses? What kind of trade partner will we have if the religious minorities in India face literally an existential threat to their existence? That's a question for our country. And in terms of a trade partnership, when there's worldwide news, it's in all the headlines of the corruption at the heart of the relationship with India's largest corporations and the government. Is that a trade partner that the oldest democracy in the world seeks? Yes, I want to first go back to the question about whether Narendra Modi cares. I think he cares deeply that India continues on this murderous path. That's what he cares about, because he was born and raised and cut his teeth in the RSS, which is a far-right, I would say, fascist organization that its blueprint is to render India a Hindu nation where Muslims and Christians don't belong, have no rights, don't exist. That is where Narendra Modi was formed, and this is the path that was laid down in the founding documents of the RSS. When in 2002, when the Gujarat carnage took 2,000 or more lives of Muslims, when he was asked to comment, he made a comment that showed just how much he cares, that he cares as much as if a puppy was killed in the road. That's how much he cares. The real question is, does India care? And they will tell us next year in the election if they care about the fact that in states like Uttarakhand, we mentioned, there are black crosses. It's so chilling, placed on Muslim houses and businesses, and people, Muslim families, Muslim business owners have to flee for their lives. Around India, hundreds of Hindu citizens come together and take group oaths not to give their business to Muslims. This is what is happening in India's civil society. This is happening under our watch. This is what is happening. You asked about my faith, Hinduism. They are Hindu. My family, my community is Hindu. They're devout Hindu, and they are veering, careening to the right, and they have lost their way. They do not see what is happening. They are reading the misinformation. They are getting lies on their WhatsApp, and they are willfully blind. That is where we are, and I know because I'm Hindu. Some of us, the people who reach out to Hindus for Human Rights, some people are awake and alert. We are the vanguard. Not in our name is what we say. You asked about Hindu religious leaders that are speaking up. I don't want to say their names because I don't want violence to happen to them. But Swami Agnivesh is no longer here. He was one radical monk that always spoke against this hatred, always. And he died in part, his life was shortened by 2 brutal beatings by Hindu nationalist mobs. And if you look at the attendance at the Parliament of World Religions just last month, you will see that quite a few Hindu religious leaders spoke for unity. And there's one beautiful thing that happened just a few days ago. So in December 2021, hundreds and hundreds of saffron-clad Hindu religious leaders, women and men, came together in the holy city of Haridwar and openly, proudly, you can see it on YouTube, called for a genocide of Muslims. That was heartbreaking for a Hindu like me and the people in my organization. But there's hope. There always has to be hope. A few days ago, on the 16th and 17th of September, 25 Hindu religious leaders gathered in that same holy city of Haridwar for a peace gathering. It's 25 in a country of 1.4 billion. It's a drop in the bucket, but we need that drop in the bucket is our salvation. And so the real question, sir, is do we care? And if we care, what are we going to do when 100,000, 200,000, some astronomical number of Muslims or Christians are killed in a catastrophe that is about to happen? What will we say? Will we say that happened on our watch and we're sorry? It'll be too late.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And on behalf of our Vice Chair, Frederick Davey, and my fellow commissioners, it's my honor and responsibility right now to close today's hearing.